Earlier, I spoke with Stephanie Weir, Director of Coral Reef Conservation at the Nature Conservancy. I asked her about efforts around the world and the major challenges.
Current conservation efforts are not enough. This is the case for pretty much all of our conservation work at this point. What's going on is we're not keeping pace with the threat. As population grows, so do the threats. I think that what we're going to need to do now is develop new innovative partnerships and start thinking a lot more creatively if we want to keep pace with the threat. Um, the biggest thing that we can do is reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions for coral reefs globally.
Can you give an example of some of the conservation efforts that are underway, and what are the biggest challenges to those efforts?
I think the biggest challenge to conservation as a whole is that there's this false dichotomy, putting coral conservation or conservation in general against economic progress and development, when the reality is that they are really complementary to each other, conservation and progress, and we depend heavily on healthy lands and healthy oceans to prosper and grow.
Well, what part or parts of the world are coral reefs seeing the most drastic changes?
So coral reefs across the world are seeing major changes. The Caribbean certainly is a place that's experiencing serious decline. Part of this is due just to geography. It's a shallow water basin, meaning the water is going to be warmer and the conditions for corals are going to be more stressful. But you can find yourself in Australia or in Indonesia or in East Africa, and corals are facing stress there as well.
Well, is climate change having an effect on the health of these coral reefs? And if so, is there anything that can be done to counteract it? I mean, if it is climate change, then it's much bigger than you and I.
Right. So as somebody that's focusing on coral reef conservation, it certainly is much bigger than you and I. It's a global problem, and it's not just coral reefs that are facing the problem of climate change. Climate change is a particular problem for coral reefs. There's two things that go on in the context of coral reef conservation that we think about. Both relate to the greenhouse gas emissions. One is ocean acidification, which is something that people haven't heard a lot about. The more CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, it has to go somewhere. It gets absorbed by the ocean, which changes ocean chemistry. This change in chemistry basically causes what we call osteoporosis of the reef. So it's more acidic, making it difficult for corals to grow their skeletons. They're made out of calcium carbonate. It also makes it difficult for any other shelled organism, so a clam, an oyster, a lobster, or a crab, to grow their shell. So that's a problem for all of ocean life. The other problem that people have probably heard a little bit more about is warming. So the climate change that we're experiencing is warming the oceans. And that warming is a problem for reefs because they live in a very narrow temperature range. And when it goes beyond that, they start having problems. You've heard possibly about coral bleaching, which is when it gets too hot and corals expel the colorful algae that give them their color. So corals would otherwise be white, but they're pink and blue and green. When they expel those pink and green algae, they turn white. We call it coral bleaching. And if they can't recover, if it stays warm too long, then they die.
Definitely, this is an issue that is not going away anytime soon. Stephanie Weir, thank you so much for joining us from the U.S. state of North Carolina.